Hello, on another episode of the APORDE Podcast. My name is Thobani K, and today I am sitting with Mushtaq. Can you please introduce yourself to the audience?
Well, my name is Mushtaq Khan. I'm a professor of economics at SOAS, University of London. I work on institutional economics.
So I've been involved here in taking a little bit of images, and I just heard in passing what may seem to be a very interesting lecture about governance. But what I got from it was, I feel like you are somebody that people should listen to, but somehow that might not be the case. I don't know if I'm correct or wrong. How would you say it?
So I think there's a lot of good ideas out there, and it's sometimes difficult to get a hearing. But I think my work is quite well known in the circles of policy making. I do a lot of research work for the FCDO, the UK's Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office, which is the successor of DFID. So a lot of UK research on developing countries happens through them. And I lead some big research consortia through that. So my work is getting recognized globally in terms of an alternative way of thinking about governance. So not thinking of governance as big systemic changes, which are very difficult to achieve in developing countries because developing countries are essentially the characteristics, the distribution of power and capabilities that I call the political settlement. And the political settlement is one of my main contributions to institutional economics. That distribution of power and capabilities is not conducive right now for an immediate transition to what we call a rule of law, well-governed, good governance society. So what we have to achieve is a lot of sectoral, very specific governance improvements that allow development to be accelerated, and I call that developmental governance, which is this incremental, pragmatic, and feasible reforms. And feasible means that you have to take the existing political settlements seriously. You have to understand what the distribution of power and capabilities are, and then you have to design your policies so that they actually get enforced and actually get implemented to achieve the development results. This broad framing is actually quite widely understood by people who are in my field. So this is a different but recognized way of thinking, which is counter to a lot of mainstream or orthodox ways of thinking about governance. So in that sense, my work is recognized. I think there's a lot of ongoing research going on because that framing of governance, political settlements, and institutions is at different levels. At one level, it's tracking how societies are evolving, what conflicts might emerge, and so on, which is a very macro picture. There's a meso analysis, which is really about sectoral development and designing policy. And increasingly, there's a very micro analysis, which is really understanding how societies work absolutely at the ground level and how those negotiations and so on are mediated through both formal and informal structures. So the political settlements and the alternative governance approach that I have has a huge number of applications. And one of the applications is anti-corruption, because we think of anti-corruption assuming that our societies really are almost formalized, everyone is following the rules, a few people are breaking the rules. Can we detect them and punish them, and then everything will be fine? Whereas my approach and the political settlements approach says that it's not like that at all. In largely informal societies, from the perspective of formal rules, most people are breaking most rules most of the time, or at least a lot of the rules a lot of the time. And so the standard approach of transparency, accountability doesn't work. So that's also what I've been lecturing on at APORDE. I've been talking about how you can rethink anti-corruption, just like we rethink governance, as a set of feasible interventions that achieve better development outcomes by redesigning policies so that within the policy itself, there are actors with the power and the interest, out of their own self-interest, who will ensure that the policy delivers results because they benefit from it. And I think this rethinking of policy design, of what makes policy implementable, what is feasible anti-corruption, what is feasible governance, they basically add up to a really pragmatic and practical way of thinking about development itself.
So is it safe to say you frame this corruption as not of a moral failing, but you frame it in terms of power, institutions, and incentives? Could you unpack that?
Yes, absolutely. I think corruption is nothing moral about it, because people who engage in corruption. So the thing is that corruption is ubiquitous in developing countries. And I think it would be wrong to say that all these people who are engaging in different types of corruption all lack any moral compass. Right? So corruption is a very complex issue. If you're in a developing country, even if you're a very moral person, to get a lot of things done, you have to use informal processes. And so these informal processes are so ubiquitous that people don't even think of it as corruption. They think of it as the way things get done. And if you don't understand these societies, you might describe that as culture. I think that's also a misunderstanding. It's not culture, it's not morality. It's actually how things get done. And things get done in that way because there is a distribution of power and capabilities, and the people who are more powerful are always bending the rules to their benefit, and that's how this whole system works. The violations of rules, the informal structures, informal rules, are just as important as the formal rules in reproducing the distribution of power in the system. So the system is pretty robust. It's not anarchy. There is a structure. And that structure has its own logic. If you don't understand that to start with, you can't discriminate between the different types of corruption that are going on, the different informal processes. And the whole approach that comes from this is that we need to focus not on fixing every informality, every transaction that is informal, everything that could be described as corruption, because then you'd be tackling an impossibly large problem. So what you have to do is to use good economic and political economy analysis to identify types of violations and types of informality that are A, having a bad impact on development, have a big negative impact, but B, are also feasible to address by mobilizing somewhat different policies and mobilizing existing actors and their power and their interests to block these violations. So there's no point identifying really serious types of corruption that you actually can't immediately block. And there's no point identifying a million types of petty corruption that you could block, but it wouldn't make a huge deal of difference. It's getting to that sequential approach of identifying important problems that can be solved and then sequentially solving them on and on and on. And that process is development. That process is creating new opportunities, new productive processes, new businesses, improved health outcomes and education outcomes, and all of that ultimately involves feasible improvements in governance and anti-corruption. And so what I'm describing is nothing different from actually doing development properly.
Many industrial policies fail not because of the lack of vision, but because of implementation constraints. What do you see is needed in order to make industrial policy work?
So the failure of industrial policy is part of the same old failure of governance. Well, what is industrial policy? Industrial policy is saying that left to themselves, market actors won't carry out the investments that will bring up new industries and new sectors and new firms. Why? Because some of these investments are very risky and very tricky. For example, you need to invest in building new organizational capabilities in new firms. This is very tricky. What kind of contract do you write? How do you enforce this contract? Private investors don't want to do that kind of stuff. So what governments have always done is they have found ways of providing resources for those critical investments. And that's the industrial policy resource. So that can happen through providing tariff protection to infant industries, providing them with export subsidies, providing them with cheap credit or cheap land. Those things provide resources for firms which are not yet competitive and could not survive in open competition with more productive firms. They provide them time to do learning by doing and to raise their productivity. That's the theory. Theory is fine. The problem is, if you are providing these resources without the governance structure to make sure that these resources are actually going to be converted into very high effort learning by doing, what ends up is that you are feather bedding firms which are using these resources to lead an easy life, to create lots of jobs, but never actually raising their productivity to become competitive. And so a lot of industrial policy fails because we haven't figured out how to actually govern those resources so that the resource is converted into productivity. And the problem here is that because the distribution of power is different in different countries, what happened in South Korea or what happens in China cannot be replicated in an India or a Bangladesh or a Nigeria or a South Africa. So, for example, in South Korea, to simplify hugely, the government in the 1960s would give resources to firms, and that would be conditional on achieving export growth and so on. And if the firm failed to do that, meaning it did not put in the right amount of effort to raise its productivity, the government could withdraw this subsidy and in some cases could allocate that plant to another owner to run. Okay? Now, how could they do that? They could do that because there was a very specific distribution of power and capabilities between state agencies, firms, and other actors like political actors, which prevented anyone from protecting firms that failed to deliver. Now, if you tried to do that in a South Africa or a Bangladesh, you would fail because the firm that is getting this resource would quickly make alliances with political parties, bureaucrats, and so on, and trade unions or whatever. And then if the government says you're not performing and we'll take the resources away, the firm would be able to put up quite a lot of resistance in terms of opposition to that strategy, and it will fail. So if you can't do that, then the South Korean approach to industrial policy shouldn't even be tried, because the success of that strategy depends on the credible threat of withdrawing the subsidy. So what I was talking about in one of my lectures is that there are other ways of doing industrial policy. So in Bangladesh, for example, industrial policy was designed almost accidentally, but it emerged in a way that incentives were created for high effort learning, but in a way that could be policed given the distribution of power and capabilities in the country, in other words, its political settlement. And the way it worked was that in, for example, the case of the garments industry, the investments for increasing productivity through organizational learning in the first instance came from private sector investors. But they wouldn't have invested and taken that risk unless there was a promise of a very high return if they succeeded. So what the government did is, I'm not going to go into the details, but what it did was it created a policy framework where the Bangladeshi firm sent people to a South Korean firm. The South Korean firm trained them up in their organizational capabilities. They came back to Bangladesh and worked the Bangladeshi firm. When the Bangladeshi firm actually exported, the South Korean firm that had done the training got a massive reward. So now, the way the incentives were structured, the resources could not be captured using the distribution of power because there were no resources given upfront, or what I describe as ex ante, right? So if the government had given the Bangladeshi firm a load of subsidies and said, now take these subsidies and go to South Korea and learn how to do this productivity growth and come back, the chances are it wouldn't have worked because the Bangladeshi firm would have taken this money and would have led an easy life, knowing subconsciously or consciously that there is no way that this money would be extracted back from them. So they didn't actually do that. The way they did it created a lot of checks and balances between the Bangladeshi firm and the Korean firm, because the Bangladeshi firm checked the Korean firm to speed up the learning because they wouldn't make any money till they came back. And the Korean firm would check the Bangladeshi managers if they weren't learning because the Korean firm wouldn't make the money till they learned and went back. In other words, the enforcement, instead of being a vertical enforcement from above, became a horizontal enforcement between the actors. So if your political settlement is such that the vertical enforcement won't work, you need to figure out different ways of horizontal enforcement where different actors check each other out of their self-interest. And this is exactly the way I think about anti-corruption, I think about policy implementation reforms. In most developing countries, we neither have the political settlement of a rule of law advanced country, nor do we have the political settlements of developmental states in South Korea, China, and East Asia. And so those models are wrong models for us to design our policy. We have to design our policy in line with our political settlements, which are also different, but are more similar. I mean, the political settlement in Bangladesh is more similar to South Africa than either of these are to United States or South Korea, right? So the normal developing countries, Nigeria, Bangladesh, South Africa, and India, Pakistan, have more to learn from each other because all these countries share very weak vertical enforcement capacities. That is, these states find it very difficult to discipline powerful actors. When a powerful actor breaks a rule, takes a subsidy, takes a bank loan, and doesn't deliver, very little happens, right? So we have to design our policies in a way that we leverage where we are strong. We are actually quite strong in horizontal checks. Our horizontal checks are very strong. So if you look at everything that succeeds in developing countries of our type, is because we've accidentally discovered a way of leveraging these horizontal checks so that competition, that check and balance actually make things work. So my work is actually formalizing what is actually in plain sight. And if you keep your eyes open, you know that harping on about South Korean industrial policy in South Africa is a waste of time. There's no way you can enforce these things. So you could enforce it on a few firms and so on, but it's really, the challenge in South Africa is to develop thousands and thousands of middle-sized firms, and if I may say so, where the entrepreneurs are black and they bring in the excluded sections of the population. An industrial policy which is focusing on 3 or 4 big white-run firms, to me, is not industrial policy. It's not actually changing the distribution of power and capabilities in society. And if you have to design your industrial policy for that middle sector with groups that have been historically ignored and discriminated against, you need to rethink your policy because you can't do top-down industrial policy for that segment. It won't work, the resources will be captured and it will be lost. But it's urgent, I would say, in South Africa to create a black, productive, dynamic entrepreneurial class which can create hundreds of thousands of jobs. And if you put the problem like that, you have to come up with the governance arrangements which will make sure that those resources are not wasted and captured. So actually what I'm talking about is practical reform, practical problem-solving approaches to creating jobs, to creating inclusion, and creating a change in society.
I feel like I've learned so much. You have very great power of explaining things in a simple manner. My last question before we run out of time is, you have published widely and worked with governments in Bangladesh, Nigeria, Tanzania, Uganda, and others to advise on industrial policy and anti-corruption measures. What would be your career advice to a young scholar?
That's a tough one because I think that, the way our academics is structured, young scholars are forced into universities and courses and learning which is based on academic publications. And increasingly, if you're an economist, into academic publications in largely mathematical type journals. And I think I would say that you need to have some of those skills. Okay, to be a good policy advisor, you cannot say, I am not interested in economics. You will not get very far. But the kind of work that I do combines that basic economics knowledge with something that most economists don't have, which is the practical knowledge of how their societies actually work. And this is almost an ethnographic approach to understanding your society, to understand how the society really works in an everyday sense. For example, I think most economists won't be able to explain to you the process through which a business is actually set up in their country, a middle-sized business. If you actually want to understand that process, and you look at the formal rules of how to set up a company and how to get a loan, you will not even understand 10% of what's going on. Most of that process is a lot of informal bargaining, negotiation, knowing the right people, knowing the people you're going to trade with, building that trust. That process of ethnographic understanding of how businesses work, how the health sector works, how your industrial policy works or doesn't work, is a starting point, right? So to understand what kind of policies will work, you need to understand how the society is working right now. So you have to combine economic knowledge with what I call political economy knowledge. You need to understand the history of your country and the history of other countries. You need to read a lot of history from different perspectives, because not all histories are accurate. So the more you read, the more triangulation you do of different interpretations of what happened in China, what happened in South Korea, you build up a convincing understanding for yourself and an ethnographic approach of keeping your eyes and ears open, just sitting and observing how things work. And you will realize this is very different from what the books say, how it's supposed to be working. You need to combine these three things. You need to combine economic knowledge, you need to combine history and political economy knowledge, and you need to combine ethnographic, observational knowledge of how reality operates in your country. This is why it's so difficult. This is why actually the number of people who really have an impact on designing policy and changing things is very small. Because people are over-specialized in one thing. They understand the economy, but they don't understand how different their society is from what the textbook says. So they don't have the right starting point. We need to combine that, and we need to train the next generation to have enough of these different components in their understanding. And then they need to work with more advanced research teams and so on to get an experience of how to apply this complex knowledge in practical ways of coming up with interesting hypotheses that can be tested, experimented with, and then scaled up because they work. My approach to reform is very incremental and bottom up. We need to try things out on a small scale, and then we need to scale up. But the point is, you can't just try things out randomly. You need to select what you're going to try based on a really good understanding of your history and what worked and what didn't work. So you design an intervention, a new approach, which is based on a lot of prior knowledge, because you can't do 1 million experiments. Now, that experiment might not work, but it has a higher chance of working than if you were randomly testing out hypotheses. So the point of having all this prior knowledge is you reduce the scope of failure. You try, 5 things, and you have a chance that 2 of them will work. Whereas if you start with no idea and you have textbook knowledge, and you have a textbook theoretical understanding of people and their incentives and how do I change incentives to make them behave differently, and you don't understand how the reality is, you might have to carry out 1 million experiments to find one that makes a difference. So knowledge is about using all of our previous experience historically, empirically, and in a policy sense to reduce the space of failure, but then you still have to experiment and you still have to scale up what works.
Thank you, Professor Khan. This was very resourceful. All right. Thank you. That's it for today's episode, and goodbye.
Thank you.